Welcome to the Rooted Healing podcast, where we seek to deepen our kinship with the living world and with the great mystery that runs through us. This is a space where stories heal with words that weave us closer to our wild and daring natures, bringing together the expansive minds, topics, and ideas that help us heal, reimagine, and co-create the world we wish to thrive in.
I think there's an element of the imaginal and the creative that we need to claw back, because being creative and having an imagination are like a vital component, I think, of being a human being. And the imagination in particular is even getting sort of relegated to just not being important or forgotten about entirely, because if it's not real, then it doesn't matter.
Sarah Janes is a writer, researcher, and avid lucid dreamer. Her first book, Initiation into the Dream Mysteries, Drinking from the Pool of Mnemosyne, is coming out this year in the US and early next year in Britain. It explores the ancient history and philosophy of dream therapy and sleep medicine, beginning in deepest antiquity through to ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece. Sharing more than a decade of research on sleep temples and mystery schools of the Esoteric Tradition, Sarah explores the evolution of imagination, memory, and consciousness through the ages and proposes that dreams have been fundamental in the creation and development of culture. Sarah curates events and talk series, such as her recent series exploring feminine power in the ancient world, coinciding with the touring exhibition Feminine Power at the British Museum. She is also currently working with author and biologist Rupert Sheldrake and Guy Hayward at the British Pilgrimage Trust to reinvigorate the practice of dream incubation on pilgrimage in Britain. Sarah co-hosts a weekly chat show, Consciousness Hour, with Anthony Peake, discussing life after life, dreams, near-death experience and OBEs, psychedelics, altered state, synchronicity, parapsychology, and time perception. A lot of ground is covered in this episode, and I was really kept on the edge of my seat. So put your seatbelt on and enjoy this psychonautic journey with Sarah Janes. What is your affiliation with Mnemosyne? How did she find you?
Well, I suppose I found Mnemosyne really. She really resonated with me as an archetypal deity because she is the personification of remembrance. And I think there's a lot more to memory than simply remembering things and, you know, what we consider to be memory these days, just having a good memory, having good recall. In the ancient Greek mindset, Mnemosyne is the goddess of remembrance, but also of eloquence and of sense making, which I find fascinating. And as the daughter of Uranus and Gaia, she's also this product of heaven and earth. So when she's invoked in the Orphic Mysteries, for example, on the little golden tablets that you get, the little golden totem passes, it said that when you enter into Hades, when you enter into the underworld and you come across Mnemosyne, you must say to her that you are a child of the earth and starry heavens. And I think there's this divine remembrance in Mnemosyne where by aligning yourself with the principle or the divine inspiration perhaps of memory, that you are remembering your divine origins. So I think Mnemosyne, in a way, is what we might call the divine personification of consciousness these days, because she really is helping us make sense of our place in the world, remembering our divine origins. And also, she's the mother of all of the muses. So there's an element there that she is the pure source of inspiration, so the kind of ultimate human spirit in some ways. She acts as a psychopomp in the mysteries associated with the underworld, but she's also this celestial being as well. And when she's described as being golden and emanating light. And I think that I've become really fascinated through my research in the sort of root and source of this idea of gods and deities. And they all seem to go back to the stars and go back to the cosmos. And for ancient people in the Near East and ancient Egypt and later on Greece, they saw the stars as being living heavenly beings. And I think that that's the kind of the pure essence and the kernel of what it means to be a divine being, and that these divine beings of the stars influence the behavior of us on Earth and the planet and our weather systems and all sorts of stuff. So there's an essence of truth there as well, you know, that the stars do have an influence on us on this planet, and we are part of a cosmos. We're not just part of a planetary system.
Yeah, that makes me think back to our astral bathing weekend in the South Downs and seeing all the shooting stars and the meteorite shower. And you shared such interesting historical significance around the stars. And I feel like we sort of, we've lost that connection, like with so many things.
You know, things like light pollution are hugely underrated, but with the level of light pollution that we have in most of our areas, especially in the UK, you very rarely even glimpse the stars. I mean, where we were wasn't totally devoid of light pollution, but you could see a bit more. Where we were was near Hurstmonceau Observatory, which is a kind of protected dark skies area, so people can see a bit more of the night sky. But I remember the first time I went to Mexico and seeing the night sky there in a properly dark sky region was utterly incredible. So I think that it's when you see places like that, when you're witness to that level of sort of celestial radiance, you get a deep appreciation and understanding of just how awesome and inspiring ancient people would have considered the heavens, and that it would have been very easy for them to, and it's very easy for us to understand that those stars would have felt really important and powerful, and they are eternal. You know, in ancient concepts of the heavens, the stars are talked about as being imperishable. They're immortal, and they're there over generations. And I think as well the fact that people used to transmit more information and stories orally, so that kind of helped to create those neural pathways of remembering our history and our ancestors and the history of our community, because we've let go of that knowledge of our ancestors and of our community's history. It's harder for us to appreciate how important the stars are in that they help us to encode our relationship with the planet.
Yeah, it's this question of perspective. If we're not having the beautiful radiant celestial sky above us and we're so consumed with our problems and our woes, I almost feel like that could be a whole healing treatment. Just go somewhere where the starry sky is completely unpolluted and just stare at it and sleep under the stars and immerse yourself in the ancient myths and legends. So I think
what I was trying to achieve when we did that starbathing evening was this, I was inspired by Babylonian astral magic, which is this idea that because the stars are divine beings, the light that they produce has a kind of healing radiance. And so in the magical concepts of ancient Babylonia, Mesopotamia, Sumer, Akkadia, Assyria, this idea that if you left something, including a living human being, a patient, underneath the stars, that the divine radiance of those stars would infuse, and the Assyriologist Erica Rayner talks about this, irradiate the body and heal the body with their divine influence, which I love the idea of that. But I think, this is what we get out of immersing ourselves in nature, is this, we often get so wrapped up in ourselves and in our own identity and our physical bodies that the more time we spend fully immersed in nature, disconnected from things like devices or even our sense of self and our position in the world or our status, it's relaxing, because it's useful to sometimes feel insignificant. I think that your life isn't the most important thing in the world, and that the world will continue and the cosmos will continue, and we're part of this tapestry of life and reality and existence. And I think that those moments of transcendence that you have, they're really about popping out of the human timeline in a way, and that can be awe-inspiring, and that's when you feel really inspired and really that you feel like you're touched by the Holy Spirit perhaps. But there's something about popping out of the human timeline, which is a construct of human beings, definitely. Our time, I think I was talking recently to Julian Vane about this idea of after a certain period of time, as a child, we start to embody time and we start to feel time in our bodies. It becomes like a sense and a perception that we're existing in this time dictated reality. But as children, if anyone who's got kids knows, when you take them for a walk, they can be completely immersed in a moment, looking at a flower or looking at a raindrop, and they don't have the same sense of like, there's morning, there's breakfast time, there's lunchtime, there's this time. They're just living in the present. And I think that meditation and certain altered states and dreaming can help take you out of that sort of time construct and that embodied sense of time. And it's ultimately liberating. When you have those moments of transcendent bliss, it feels somehow that those are the moments that you're really living, that you're really connecting to the cosmos.
I love that. I'm super curious about what you've been uncovering with your research into sleep temples and this prospect of sacred sleep.
Well, I think that for our ancestors, dreaming was much more influential than it's perhaps sort of given credit for these days. But if you just look at things like dreams used as narrative devices in ancient texts, it obviously was considered some way of connecting with not only the ancestors, but divine beings, with the dead, with the future and with the past. So this is massive in and of itself anyway, the fact that the dream realm was considered to be this kind of tangible other world. And my feeling is that in dreams, I mean, most people that I speak to have had a dream where they've met someone that's died, or they've met someone that's close to them, or they've resolved some relationship trauma, perhaps, because in the dream state, one of the most fascinating things is that people are able to have these encounters with people that have died and feel very moved and touched and emotional, and often healed by a sense of closure. If they've not had a chance to say goodbye to someone that they've loved that's died, that they're able to have this experience of connecting with them. So I think for ancient people, the fact that you can really vividly see and encounter deceased people in the dream state would give this idea of the afterlife to them, and with this idea of the dead continuing in some other realm. So I think that dreaming probably did inspire the first religions, the first ideas of the afterlife, because the death cults and this idea of there being an afterlife, of preparing someone for an afterlife, is the first human rituals that are observed, really. This is something that really fascinates me. And I think that a lot of places, a lot of necropoli, burial places also have this idea that this is somewhere where you go to sleep with the ancestors as well. So some of the earliest evidence for this, I think, can be found in Anatolia, in places like Çatalhöyük, which is a small human settlement made up of a kind of honeycomb of buildings where people lived. And it's associated kind of culturally and symbolically with the kinds of things that you see at Göbekli Tepe. It's a continuation of that early Anatolian culture and whatever religion they developed around the time. But there seems to be there's a lot of art and a lot of symbolism in all these little houses. Originally they thought that it was a religious center because there was so much symbolism and so much art there, but it looks like that these were just little homes that were really highly decorated. And one of the interesting things about Çatalhöyük is that there's intramural burial in nearly all of these little houses. So bodies buried inside the homes. And then even beyond that, so this is an interesting idea of keeping the ancestors really close, or keeping family members really close, that the sleeping platforms in these houses are built on top of these intramural burials. So to me, that suggests that there's this idea that sleeping and dreaming close to the remains of a deceased person can help you connect with them in the dream realm in some way. I mean, what other reason would there be for keeping these bodies so close? It's an interesting idea to me anyway. So so that's inspiring. And then you have places like the Hypogeum in Malta, which is an necropoli, and there's a sort of suggestion that there are various little chambers where you might go to sleep there. And it makes absolute sense that if you want to dream with your ancestors, or you want to dream with deceased people, if you want to enter that other world, that you dream and you sleep close to them. So I think that this is super early evidence for this. And then later on, you start to see the dream temples and the sleep sanctuaries happening in places like Egypt and Greece. And in the ancient Near East, there was this development of this idea of sacred sleep, of the temple, any temple that's dedicated to a particular deity, be in their sacred precinct. So there begins to be this culture of if you go to sleep in the sacred precinct of a god or goddess, then by sleeping in their sacred precinct, this one place on earth where they can manifest, that they will manifest to you in the dream state. So this becomes a cultural habit. And then out of this cultural habit is born the sleep temple tradition, which is, it's an actual sanctuary dedicated to the healing power of sleeping and dreaming. And there are all sorts of other practices that go on there. But I mean, if you think about most conditions, and it's interesting that in the sleep temples in ancient Greece, they wouldn't allow anyone to come in that was too close to death. So there's a psychological element to the kinds of illnesses that were being treated in these sleep sanctuaries in the first instance. There was actually these kind of boarding houses on the fringes of these centres where if you were dying or if you were about to give birth, you'd go there instead. But once you'd passed through the sacred grove, which is almost this kind of like buffer zone for this sacred precinct, you would go through various stages of purification and preparation for this healing. So interestingly, a lot of this was about catharsis, like emotional catharsis, because it was, the concept of health in ancient Egypt and in ancient Greece is about being in harmony with the earth, with yourself, within the body. This idea of harmony is really vital to health, and it's something that we can completely see would be true these days as well. When the body becomes imbalanced in some way, we tend to become ill. So I love this. So the idea of the sleep sanctuaries in ancient Greece is that it's this beautiful, healthy, aesthetically pleasing place where you go through various activities to help bring you back into harmony with nature. So catharsis through art, through movement, through dance, through singing, also cold water bathing, purification by fasting, by abstinence from sex, from alcohol, from eating meat, and then making offerings to the gods. And the final stage of this would be this sacred sleep, and that the goal of this sacred sleep would be that in the dream itself you'd be visited by the god, and the god would either perform some physically impossible operation upon you, which is an interesting idea because I think this dream event acts as a catalyst for real world change. And interestingly, if you think about lucidity, the actual physical, biophysical, neurological state of lucid dreaming is when you're kind of in this hybrid blended state of sleeping and wakefulness. So your frontal cortex is activated, so you're able to access critical thinking, self-reflection, and anyone who lucid dreams regularly will tell you that it feels more real than reality. So I think there's a potential, a real true potential for healing in the lucid dreaming state, that if some divine action occurs in the dream, that your body responds very powerfully to that dream action or that dream catalyst, and perhaps the nervous system, the sort of deep homeostasis that we go through in the sleeping and dream cycles powerfully matches the dream action. So I think your body tries to make this dream event a reality. And I've had experiences in dreams where I've been visited by a healer or the gods, and their influence has this ecstatic, blissful effect on me, and my body feels amazing when I wake up in the morning.
Yeah, I'm absolutely fascinated in this, and I really want to explore it for my own healing and this autoimmune condition that I have. And I do, I'm a regular lucid dreamer, and I often have these crazy hypnagogic experiences. I need to just keep ritualizing it, I think, and making that intention to actually have a healing experience. It's usually quite weird, sometimes quite dark.
Well, I think this is where the idea of the gods come in and divine beings, because, I often think about, when I look at statues of gods and goddesses, or I think about gods and goddesses in the ancient world, to me, they represent this kind of psychic target for human attention. And if you hand over, it's hard for us to understand that concept of divinities in our modern world. But I think there's something about, a representation, a manifestation of a force as a physical, living, breathing being, whereby they can have more agency in the dream state. If you're going into a dream with this sort of vague idea that you want to get healing, or you want something to happen, but there isn't a kind of tangible agent to activate this, you don't get as much success. So I think this is where dream incubation and the concept of divine beings is so important. So for ancient people, they would adore and worship the god Asclepius as their dream healer. And if you went to one of his sanctuaries, there would be statues of him all around. And then beyond that, his theriomorphic form, his animal form, is the snake, which snakes were allowed to roam freely around the temple. And a snake is a very, very easy, a powerful image and symbol to conjure up. So if you were visited by a snake while you were sleeping and dreaming, you could also say that you'd been visited by the god. So I think there's something really useful about thinking about a god and adoring something, that there's something really powerful in the act of adoring, that sense of surrender and the power and the energy that you conjure up when you adore or worship something is really potent and healing in itself. And I think it's hard for us these days because it's kind of counterintuitive to everything we think. We don't want to do that. We don't want to give ourselves up. We don't want to give over our power. But when you look at things like faith healing, that's because people are completely and utterly surrendering to something that they adore and worship and they think is so much greater than themselves. And I think it can be very useful to access that. But obviously, it's open to all sorts of manipulation and corruption as well, unfortunately, because we see things like this in Christianity and Islam. Like there's something that can take hold of human beings that isn't necessarily good, but there's an enormous amount of power and healing potential, I think, in that believing and adoring in something that's greater than yourself. I often think about what could we have as a religion these days that would make sense, because I actually think the religious feeling, religious ecstasy is really potent and powerful. But what could we have these days that would be less susceptible to corruption and manipulation, which people so easily kind of start to fall into? And I think that we could very comfortably, realistically, and satisfyingly worship the earth if we thought of the earth as a living being and if we thought of the cosmos as a living being. And I think this is the root of all religions, really, is that people believed the earth was a living being, which I believe it is, and people believed the stars were a living being and that we were part of a living universe, which I think we can justifiably say is accurate. So if we felt that we were in service to the earth and in service to the cosmos, I think we would feel sort of legitimately okay with that as modern people. So yeah, that's my plan.
Oh, I love it. I love the way you're expressing it as well. How do you think our ancestors' dreams will have differed from ours based on, modern life and the things that have now influenced our sleeping world? You'd written something about that primal connection with the land and how that would have shaped our dreams. And you've got this pilgrimage, this dream pilgrimage as well.
Well, I'm really interested in the dreaming of the First Nations, of the people of Australia. And I think that if we want to look back to the way our ancestors viewed their world, their land, and their dreaming landscape, then they're the oldest culture on the planet. And I think that their ideas around the dreaming and this kind of continuum of consciousness is a window into our ancient past. And people often talk about astrology and astronomy being invented in the ancient Near East or Egypt, but I think there's this much deeper ancient idea of star law in Africa that then travels to Australia via one of the first waves of migration out of Africa. And there's a continuity there with the people that live in Australia nowadays. And there's an interesting book by the anthropologist Charles Mountford where he talks about meeting people in the middle of the desert in Australia, and that they had a myth and a story that related to every single star in the night sky down to the fourth magnitude. And that's like an extraordinarily complex appreciation and understanding for the stars. And the thing is, the stars can be used the stars and the planets, close observations of them have helped us over millennia to identify when, say, for example, fish will run in rivers, or when certain animals will breed, when seasons come in for collecting certain plants. So there's an absolute truth to the fact that the stars are this calendar. And one thing I'm really interested in is this idea of the stars being the writing of heaven, that they relate to language, that they're the first language that human beings learned, and that all subsequent languages are an evolution really of this really, really ancient star lore. Because if you look at the kind of legends of ancient languages, they're all given by the star gods. They're all given to human beings by heavenly beings. And I think there's something really meaningful in that there's this idea that words themselves have a heavenly origin.
Wow, that's quite delightful to contemplate. Can you share your process of birthing your book and why you began each initiatory chapter with psychodramatic narrative? You've spoken of celestial language, so what can story do for our dreams?
Well, I've always really loved stories, and when I was a kid, because I've been lucid dreaming since I was a kid, and my ideas around lucid dreaming were that if I was just good at lucid dreaming and I could do it all the time, that I could transcend death and be immortal in a dream realm. That was a big thing for me. And then the other thing was my dreams were so fantastic to me and such a source of inspiration that I wanted to be a dream sort of film director, and the things that my dream scenes, I really wanted to create film versions of them so other people could see them, so I could watch them myself, because I just loved the dream world so much. So I'm a big fan of Alexandra Jodorowsky, and I've always been fascinated sort of aesthetically. Anything to do with dreaming has been my thing creatively and aesthetically. I find dream types of things just interesting. So I love Jodorowsky's idea of psychomagic. His whole thing is sort of psychomagic therapy. If you watch something like The Holy Mountain, it's this archetypal journey through the tarot, and something happens to you when you watch a film like that that's deeply archetypal, very graphic, of a sort of, it's all about sex and death, which are like two big themes for dreaming and for our own kind of emotional in our own emotional landscape as well. So I find when you watch something like Jodorowsky, it works similarly to the sort of psychodrama that would have occurred in ancient mystery school performances. This idea that theatre and drama and creative performances have this deep effect on the psyche, because you more strongly kind of emotionally relate to drama. When you read a book, you can empathize with characters, you kind of get inside the mind of people, you experience the world through their eyes. And if you think about a favorite book, when you think about it, you remember it visually as if you've sort of lived there, and as if you've experienced it. So I wanted to capitalize on the power of narrative to create this sort of visual imagery and this dream landscape. And so I did my own dream incubation practices whilst I was writing the book. After each period of research, because each chapter represents a kind of different cultural period, I would incubate on that cultural period, and then the dreams that I had, I would make a narrative out of. So that's what I've done. And my idea, because they're really weird and really graphic stories, so my hope is that because they're kind of speaking in dream language, that will connect with the reader and that they will experience their own dream language in response to that. But yeah, I mean, I've always loved reading books, and I read more novels probably than I read non-fiction, and I think there's something actually really powerful in fiction. And if you look at the influence of, say, like TV shows and films on cultural narratives, I think that artistic productions like that, or our culture, creates human consciousness, and that it creates a feedback system. I've been watching The X-Files a lot recently. I'm a massive fan of The X-Files. I think it's really good, but I can already see that it starts to influence my dreams. And like the other night, I was having like pure X-File dreams all night. So I think we underestimate that, because the sheer amount of visual and sound landscapes that are out there now are insane. So if you look at the kind of mythic landscape of our ancestors, there was a certain kind of mythic cognition that they had that perhaps we don't have anymore. You know, they had gods and goddesses. They knew the stories and myths of their gods and goddesses, and they lived in the same area, or they traveled to only certain areas in the world. So there was a different worldview and a different perspective of reality for those people. And I think that would have had a massive influence on their dreams and the way that they understood their dreams. So for us, we're kind of getting a bit of everything all the time. We're like, you know, international, global, world mindset. I mean, I think often about, even up until relatively recently, when sailors would go on long voyages to countries that hadn't been discovered yet, and they didn't know what they were going to expect, and there was this kind of sense of mystery. And when they arrived on these exotic shores, having never seen a palm tree, having never seen the sorts of animals or people that lived there, that there was something about mystery as a sense of going into the unknown, of really having no expectations. Whereas these days, nothing surprises us anymore. If we don't think we know everything, we think we can know everything. We think we can see everything. And we've seen photographs and films, or we've traveled to like distant places. I remember even as a kid, I didn't go abroad until I was in my late teens, I think. And there was limited access even then to sort of far-flung shores, and I had imaginings of what these places were like. But if you think about, you know, ancient sailors thinking that they might drop off the end of the earth, or that they might encounter like a mythical giant squid beast in the sea, that's a really different state of consciousness, I think.
Totally. It makes me think about my grief of how quickly people will show a picture or a video on their phone of something they're talking about, rather than sitting together and really describing it and allowing us to enter a unified space of imagination. And I wonder how that plays out in dreamscapes and in the cultivation of imagination, as we're seeing things in 2D in that frontal manner, and we're not building it and crafting it in our imaginal realm.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea. Like, there's definitely this idea now. I mean, I read this depressing article about how people travel to certain countries because they look good on Instagram these days even. And One of my most vivid memories is being in Thailand, sitting on a rock on top of this island, and thinking about it now. I didn't have a phone. I never took a photograph, but I wrote it all down. And because I wrote it all down and I fully immersed myself in the experiencing of it, it's one of my most vivid memories. And I think, you know, I do these, I've been doing these nature walks and these nature immersion days for the Psychedelic Society with Sam Gandhi, who's an ecologist. And we were talking about how people go on walks these days and they'll take a photograph of something before they've even looked at it really themselves. And also, one of the things that I found amazing about lockdown was that because people were on their own, they were being out in nature on their own for the first time in ages. And actually, you observe when you take a group out for a nature immersion experience, unless you sort of make it happen, that they'll often end up chatting and not actually looking or being in nature, that you have to carve out those sorts of experiences these days because we're just not used to it. And I think you experience a sort of an expansion of awareness when you're alone in nature, and it's a different, richer experience than being there with other people in some senses. And I think it's next level again to have that experience of being immersed in nature with other people, kind of entangled in a group community consciousness as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be gained from those experiences.
Well, can you tell us about your dream pilgrimage with the British Pilgrimage Trust?
So I've been working with the British Pilgrimage Trust and Rupert Sheldrake and my friend Pascal, who is researching, sort of specialising in near-death experiences at the University of Greenwich, but is interested in altered states and dreaming as well. So him and Rupert are designing a survey for people that come on our dream pilgrimage experience. So this idea of sacred sleep is something that filters down from the ancient world into early Christianity and is still a thing these days. There's a pilgrimage to a tiny island in Greece called Tinos where people still go to dream with the Virgin Mary at this tiny little church, and it's a pilgrimage that hundreds of people turn up for every year. So some of these ideas have been maintained, especially in Greek Orthodoxy, I think, because the folk traditions in Greece are so strong that a lot of these ideas, there's even a Virgin Mary of the snakes, which kind of harks back to the Asclepian snake healing tradition as well. This idea of sacred sleep is something that Rupert's really keen to reinvigorate in the Christian tradition. So we're going to go on this walk through Hastings Country Park, which is an absolutely beautiful nature reserve. I live in Hastings. And this kind of skirts the coast, but it's beautiful, ancient gill ravine landscape, really, really old ferns, and just a really beautiful place to go for walking. And then after we've done that, we're going to end up at All Saints Church in Hastings Old Town, which has Anglo-Saxon roots, actually. And there's even an ancient Saxon cross there. And so that reminded me of The Dream of the Rood, which is this medieval Anglo-Saxon poem, which was written to kind of convert perhaps Anglo-Saxon warriors to Christianity. But it's fascinating because the way it's written in itself suggests a different perspective of the dream state and of ideas of religious feeling and memory. So it's the dream of the rood. The rood is the tree that Christ was sacrificed upon, and in this poem, the poet encounters the tree, and the tree tells their story. So it's fascinating because it combines the kind of pagan animistic worldview of the Anglo-Saxons. It communicates in their language, but it communicates a Christian narrative. There's a really beautiful translation of it that I found, because quite often a lot of these ancient poems are translated in a kind of Old English way, and so it uses there's perhaps too much bias to the way these things were written, so they tend to be written in sort of biblical oldie worldy type of way. Same with a lot of ancient translations. So I found a great translation that I'm going to read when we bring people into the church. So the idea is that they'll sleep on the site of this ancient Anglo-Saxon church, and before it was an Anglo-Saxon church, it was probably an ancient Celtic site of worship or Druidic site of worship. So often these things kind of overlay one another. It's obviously significant. And I did, for the Psychedelic Society, we did a dream incubation in the graveyard there, actually. So that should be really interesting. So we're going to have access to the church that day and do a dream incubation practice there. So I do my dream incubation like a kind of guided hypnagogic meditation, with the idea that you're kind of seeding the hypnagogic state with suggestions. And what I find with hypnagogia is that if you kind of consciously enter into hypnagogia and you have an intention and you set certain goals, that these things will manifest in the dream. And I love to do lucid dreaming from being awake through sort of consciously entering hypnagogia. And I describe it to people as, it's a bit like Alice falling down the rabbit hole in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, that she maintains that sort of conscious awareness of who she is. I mean, Alice in Wonderland is a brilliant example of lucid dreaming for me, actually, because she's constantly throughout that whole story reminding herself of who she is. And I think a lucid dream, essentially for me, is a dream in which you remember who and where you are. And that in and of itself creates this sense of bliss and wonder.
Well, I did an episode with Tree Carr, which was an epic conversation all about lucid dreaming and hypnagogic phenomena. And one of my patrons wrote to me and asked, well, what about the people who can't remember their dreams? So what advice would you give for dream recollection and developing this kind of consciousness exploration?
I would suggest doing some dream incubation sessions during the afternoon, because you're more likely to have vivid dreams during afternoon naps, and it takes the pressure off. It's my same advice actually for people that suffer from insomnia, is to try to make some space for afternoon naps, because then you feel less worried about not being able to sleep. You know, part of insomnia is exacerbated by being anxious about the fact that you can't sleep. So it's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. So afternoon naps are really useful. But I mean, it's a boring technology, or it doesn't get as much appreciation as it should. But dream journaling is really important for this process of remembering. The art and the act of remembering something, I think, is deep, because when you do write down a dream, you are remembering it to your conscious awareness. And lucid dreaming is interesting because your frontal cortex is activated when you're lucid dreaming. You generally remember it, and it doesn't sort of evaporate like other dreams, because it works in the same way that a conscious event happens. It's sort of memorized in a similar way, so they tend to be much more easy to remember. But for an ordinary dream, what I tend to do is when I wake up, write something down straight away, even if you think you haven't got much, because a lot of people will think they wake up and they think, I can't remember anything, or there's some vague bit that I remember. But if you write down that vague bit, often what you find is the whole thing starts flowing back, and you start to get more and more information. I had this dream, I find memory and dreaming really fascinating, and I think it should be the future of dream research, is the relationship between dreaming and memory. And I think it's the key to understanding dreaming is memory, really, which is why I do associate with Mnemosyne so much, because I think she is the epitome of dream memory, and that she was invoked in the sleep temples because of her power of remembrance, because it isn't just about remembering your dream, it's about remembering that you're dreaming in a dream. So I think that that's why she's so important to the sleep sanctuaries. So my advice is dream journaling and nootropics, this sort of cognitive enhancing supplements and things like this. Anything that improves memory will improve dream recall. So that's worth thinking about. Playing memory games, that game you play when you say things like, I went to the shop and I bought this. Games like this are really useful. Anything involving language, I weirdly think Scrabble is really good for lucid dreaming and dream recall. There's something about
interesting,
the kind of mode you get into when you're trying to work out a Scrabble word that's similar to that experience of remembering yourself in a dream, where you have this tip of the tongue, like I can see a 7-letter word, but I'm not sure what it is. I'm not consciously aware of what it is yet, but I can see that it's there. And there's something about that that's very, very similar to dream memory access within a dream.
Yeah. Something that's shifted for me, because I'm like you, I've been a lucid dreamer since I was a kid. But I've really been having them loads lately, and I've been taking any opportunity I can, especially now that it's getting autumnal and wetter and colder. I'm still trying to just take an opportunity to walk barefooted and have a little garden meditation and really feel the earth through my feet and really bring awareness into my grounding, which sounds like such a stereotypical meditation, but it's amazed me because I didn't actually have the intention, but that has absolutely been how I've been coming lucid for the last month or so. Is I've been becoming aware of the ground beneath my feet and then looking down at my feet. And that's also how I've been able to not wake myself up, because that's also a challenge, right? So I've been able to be mindful and just be like, oh, okay, I'm dreaming. Let's walk slowly and not rush anything, and then just slowly start looking around.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good tip. Like, acting like you're in a dream while you're awake and you're trying to stay in a lucid dream is really interesting. And one thing I was talking about, because I'm doing this course for the Last Tuesday Society, is when you're dreaming, you seem to always be in motion. Very rarely in a dream are you static. And there's something about the lucid dream experience that you're in this constant motion, and if you stop, you risk waking up. When I was a kid, I kind of realized that in order to stay lucid, you had to move your body slowly or keep that momentum going. And I find that interesting. But as you were talking about having lucid dreams since you was a kid, I also have these dreams, and I'll be interested to know if you have them as well. And I think it's related to seasonal shifts, but probably twice a year, maybe only once a year, I have this incredibly long sleep that seems to last, it's like 10 or 12 hours. And then when I wake up, I feel like I'm starting a new chapter of my life. And it reminds me of the Virginia Woolf book, Orlando, and the film with Tilda Swinton in it. So she goes to sleep, this character goes to sleep, and she lives forever. And after she's, lived in Elizabethan times, for example, she goes to sleep and then she wakes up and she's in another kind of time realm, and she's a very rich person, and even the sex changes of this person over time as well. It's a really interesting novel. So every now and again I have these dreams where I feel like when I've woken up I feel like another person. And that this interesting experience the other day when I realized that I slept for what it must have been like 10 or 12 hours, and when I woke up I felt like just changed. And I went downstairs into my friend's shop, and I realised that in my dream, he'd been in the dream and I'd been walking around his house. And then later on, other things happened where I realised that, there's a bit of this in my dream as well. And it's almost like in that dream, it's so dense, I've experienced everything in a way. Like there's so much that was in that dream that it was like I was processing everything of my life up to that point, and there wasn't anything really that entire day that happened where I couldn't say there was some aspect of it in my dream. It was like I'd gone through everything. So I've had dreams like that since I was a kid as well, and I just wonder about other people having those experiences, because it's always nice when I remember the first time I read up about what lucid dreaming was, I felt really validated by I think it's Frederick von Eden, who's a Dutch, I don't know if it's a psychoanalyst or psychiatrist or something, who coined the term lucid dreaming. And in his descriptions of being lucid, I really recognized what he was talking about. And I was like, I do that as well. It's intuitive. It's this, he was talking about spinning to stay lucid. And I do that, but sort of slowly to stay lucid sometimes. Or I might open up my eyelids with my fingers and like look around. And I think keeping that momentum and that sort of slow, like you say, feeling present and aware and passing awareness through your body all the time in the lucid dreaming state helps you to stay lucid. And then another person that I've interviewed about lucid dreaming is this woman called Rebecca Sharrock, who has highly superior autobiographical memory. And I can remember dreams from when I was if not a baby, like a toddler. And I wasn't sure whether I'd imagined that I could remember those dreams or if I really could. And when I was describing them to her, she was saying, I had exactly the same experience. And one of the things with highly superior autobiographic memory is that you do... you're lucid in all of your dreams quite oftenly. So she's lucid in all of her dreams, and she can remember being a baby, and she can remember her earliest dreams. And in my earliest dreams, I remember being in just a pure white space. And as I got older, the space sort of filled in over time. And Rebecca said that she had that same experience of having dreams where she was just in a pure white space when she was really, really young.
Wow, you're the first person I've talked to about that. I've had those baby dreams that were all white, but I had these intricate, colourful creatures appear in the whiteness. And during my time in Latin America, I saw quite a few murals that depicted these kinds of creatures, and I would point at them and proclaim, they were in my baby dreams.
I'm so glad that you've had that as well, because for ages I didn't really think about it, and then now I'm like, now I sort of get what it means. It's I've got this idea that as you grow, you develop this psychic architecture, and that's the kind of the memory palace. You kind of live in the memory palace in dreams, and you construct the idea of the psyche and the idea of a personality in the dream state. And I actually think it's the root, the place of our soul. Like people talk about houses in dreams being the mansion of the soul, and I think it's really true. And I think that those white dreams are because you're a blank slate, and you fill in and you create this personality in the dream state, and then as a result you're kind of a living personality. And so this is why I think memory is so fundamental to consciousness, because without memory we're still in that white blank state. We're not constructing dream architecture in that same way, if we're not consolidating memories. But yeah, talking about those little animals, I remember things like that as well. But the first dream that I remember being sort of emerging out of that white space, because what I remember from the white space is that slowly my favorite toys started to appear in this white space. And my favorite toy was this Fisher Price, I think it was called chat-along phone that you could pull by a cord and had a little smiley face on it. And that's the first object I remember very vividly seeing in this dream. And I remember it ringing in the dream, answering it, and it was Wurzel Gummidge telling me that he'd just killed my nan. And that was the first like neat conscious dream that I can remember, when it was really scary actually, because Wurzel Gummidge is effing terrifying. So
wow.
So yeah, so that was interesting to me, because that white space almost become like TV shows that I remember. But animals and creatures have always been a massive part of my dreams. And I always put it down to when I was a kid, I had this animal encyclopedia, and I just loved it. And it was almost like my dream resource book, because I would use all of the animals and the images that I saw in this book in my own dream scenes. And I was talking about why this might have been the case the other day, actually. And I think it's because in those old encyclopedias, like I think this particular encyclopedia, whenever I see it in a charity shop, I get it. And it was a Hamlin publication, and it was published in 1985, perhaps the first time. And every image, more or less, was like a really detailed painting. And I think there's something about painting that activates the imagination a little bit more. And because painting and the creative representation of these animals could be more creative. So one thing I've always really loved is paintings of animals that have lots of different types of the same animal in the same painting. So it's something that you wouldn't be able to get a photograph of, because one of my favorite paintings from that book is all different types of wading birds and herons in this one swamp scene. And my dreams often feature wading birds. And I think there's something about the novelty and the exoticness of exotic animals all in the same scene that activates the imagination a little bit more than just seeing a photograph of one bird in the swamp, you know. So I mean, it's interesting because encyclopedias these days rarely have paintings. They'll mostly be photographs of animals. So I think that's something that was something that inspired me.
Oh gosh, so interesting. I want to go back a little bit to the memory palace concept and that building the inner architecture. And something that was recently shared in a lecture I was watching was this idea that what if the imaginal realm it's a real collective place, it's a real collective archive, and we're all sculpting it, we're all architects of this space. And it just absolutely fascinates me, because there's so many buildings and they have such strong feelings in my dreams. And then it makes you think about how home is shaping your personality, how your physical surroundings are constantly shaping your inner architecture. And oh gosh, I just think it's a huge topic.
Yeah, I think there's something about the home as a sort of axis mundi. You know, this I read some papers about those early homes in Catalhoyuk presenting this axis mundi idea. So it's this connection between the heavenly realm, the terrestrial realm, and the other world, which makes sense because they've got the bones of people that have died underneath them. They're living in this realm that is all really highly decorated in this terrestrial zone, and it's decorated like a sort of microcosm of the world that they experience as well. And then you've got the heavenly realm above them, and for the houses at Catalhoyuk, they were all accessed via the roof. They didn't have doors. So just this concept of where do you live, this space, this home. I know a lot of people now who are living as kind of digital nomads, and they don't have a home or a base. And I think that affects the way you experience the world as well. If you don't have a base, if you don't have somewhere that you go back to every single night, or you haven't created your microcosm of the world as you see it in a place that you live, I think that affects your consciousness as well. So I think there's definitely something to be said for that. I mean, I think that consciousness and perception is shaped by these things. And if you think about the the sort of advent even of thresholds, gates, of boundary spaces, of apportioning land, or of setting country limits even, or cultural limits. All of these things influence the way that we see and perceive reality. And I don't think they can be underestimated in the way that they've shaped human consciousness either. This idea that ancient people are exactly the same as us, I don't think that can be true. I think that there are definitely subtle differences in perception. Even if you look at communities that live in a really small scale in places like the Amazon, or in more rural, natural settings, they have a deeper relationship with the land, and there's a language of their environment that they understand that we are cut off from, because we don't have as much access to green spaces and to our nature, and we don't feel as embedded or entwined with our natural environment. We don't depend upon it as much, because we can quite easily separate or cut off from it. I mean, if I've got friends who live in the city, and I swim in the sea as much as I can living in Hastings, and I go for walks regularly in nature, but still I don't consider myself to be immersed in nature on a daily basis. But if you live in the city and you have got no greenery around you, don't have a garden, you spend your time commuting to work, coming back, and those opportunities for like really feeling connected to the land, like you say, taking your shoes off and feeling earth underneath your feet, people can very easily not do that at all for years at a time.
Yes, I had someone come to one of our gatherings who said he hadn't put his bare feet on the earth in 10 years. There's an indigenous language, I forget which one it is, but they have a word for shoe which directly translates to blindfold for the foot. Well, you're doing so many incredible, fascinating things. I'm drawn to everything you're cultivating. Can you tell us about your Explorers Egyptology lecture series and your pagan art club for children, amongst anything else you'd like to share?
I'm doing a series at the moment about feminine power. So we've had talks ranging from sort of ancient Egyptian gynecological treatment and biomedical Egyptology, to conceptions of ancient goddesses and sort of new research about ancient goddesses, which are, Egyptology has been a science mostly kind of carried out by men for a very long time, but more and more women are now terrific Egyptologists, and they obviously bring a different perspective, and they're more interested in the way women were perceived in ancient cultures as well. So that's been really enjoyable. I've been doing that since the beginning of lockdown. I've been running this lecture series since 2012, and it was all in person, and then during lockdown I took it all online, and my interest really sort of swerved all towards ancient cultures. And I think that this is why I want to do things like Pagan Art Club and classes with children about ancient cultures, because they love talking about ancient Egypt especially, and trying to get into the mindset of ancient Egyptian people, and they can be deeply philosophical. I was always really philosophical as a child, and I think that is something that doesn't get enough encouragement through schools, and the way that the school curriculum is working these days, or not working. So I did work as a teacher for a while in South London, and I always felt that the curriculum was incredibly restrictive. And when you get children that are deeply creative, deeply philosophical, like great thinkers, to try to fit them into like a particular way of thinking, just because to become a teacher you have to be quite academically minded and qualification orientated, whereas I was never like that at school, and I became a teacher through some sort of weird loophole at the time, because I didn't have the qualifications to be a teacher, but because I enjoyed it, they let me do it, and they were going to send me to Goldsmiths to do my PGCE, but so I felt that it was a bit too rigid for me. But so now I do like after school clubs, or off-piste activities, and then you can have just really meaningful conversations with kids, and they're great. And I want to encourage kids to think for themselves, and to, especially as so many schools have a Church of England component, and it's weird because the vast majority of parents that I know are not Christians, and yet their school, their children are getting indoctrinated in Christianity. And I don't have an issue with Christianity as such, but I do think that it's important to look at all religions, and the the kind of essence of religion itself, you know. So at Pagan Art Club, for me, I want to show kids the kind of, or, you know, I want to explore with kids this idea of the sort of source of culture and this nature connection idea, this animistic idea of the world. And, you know, I think a lot of people get turned off of religion and spirituality because of Christianity in school. They just think it's nonsense, and therefore they don't want to explore religion. But I find it sort of the philosophy and the idea of religion and the essence of religion like really, really fascinating. So I love doing work like that with kids. It's really fun.
Yeah, I think I would have absolutely loved you to come along as a teacher when I was a kid. I think that would have been incredible, because it's just not at all presented to children, all these fascinating areas of thought and exploration that could really plant that early seed of curiosity. So what do you think is the future of our dreams and our sense of spirituality? You already spoke to that need for some sort of religious thing to give us that sense of worship and otherness. But what do you think may come of all this scientific inquiry and the global crisis that sort of kind of seems to be at this peak moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say because there's lots of technological advances and more research being carried out with dreaming. But I think there's an element of the imaginal and the creative that we need to claw back, because these being creative and having an imagination are like a vital component, I think, of being a human being. And the imagination in particular is even getting sort of relegated to just not being important or forgotten about entirely, because if it's not real, then it doesn't matter. Meanwhile, at the same time, you have the sort of conspiracy theory insanity, you know, and people buying into narratives that are completely unimportant and ridiculous, because I think they show that there is this need for the imaginal and for the creative. I'm always interested by people that don't ever read novels or don't ever read fiction. They just read non-fiction. And it seems to be like a little bit more of a male thing to read only non-fiction. But this idea that fiction and fantasy aren't important, I think, is crazy talk. We've always had it and we need it. And so I hope that people will start to value dreaming. I mean, I'm interested in this idea of the psychedelic renaissance, but I do think that dreaming is easily as important, in fact way more important than psychedelic experiences, because they speak to the kind of root of who we really are, and they're free and available and safe for every single person. I think there's not many people that are going to be damaged by making, you know, deeper connections with their dreaming self. So whereas I see a lot of casualties of psychedelic drugs and that sort of hedonistic unintegrated exploration of psychedelic states, and dreams kind of are self-limiting in that respect. You know, obviously lots of people have trauma and they can have trauma that's been like deeply buried, but I would dare to say that it's safer to perhaps unearth or integrate that trauma in the dream state than it is with psychedelics, where you can't necessarily pull back when you might feel that you need to pull back. You know, it's a little bit more risky. So yeah, I think dreaming, if we start to develop a culture, you know, this is the big part of the reason why I want to do this dream pilgrimage thing with Rupert Sheldrake. If we start to think again about sort of sacred sleep and this relationship between our world and our dream world, then, you know, and if it's successful as well, the problem with dreaming, and, you know, the reason why I think so many people are interested in psychedelics is that this imaginal, this creative, this otherworldly experience is so important and meaningful and mind-blowing for people. But dreaming can take a while. You know, if you're not a regular lucid dreamer, or if it's not something that you know of, if you've never had a lucid dream, if you've never even had a vivid dream, then you just don't know what you're missing. And so I find it really difficult sometimes, and it's part of the reason why I stopped doing lucid dreaming workshops. I tend to do these sort of guided hypnagogic meditation workshops now, because when you're telling an audience about what a lucid dream feels like, it's sort of pointless. You want to, until you've had one. I always sort of make the association with having an orgasm. It's like, if you've never had an orgasm, you don't know what it feels like. You can kind of intellectually try to make sense of it, but a lucid dream is like that. It's like a soul orgasm.
I have so many things I want to ask you. I've read somewhere that also lucid dreaming can actually be charged by that sexual energy, thinking of the metaphor of the orgasm. And I find that curious as well, because, what is that sexual energy? It's life force. It's creative energy.
Well, orgasm's a really good tool to use to become lucid in the first place, because, I often think about that, the sort of what they call the little death, that experience post-orgasm, when you're kind of in this liminal nowhere, you're not asleep, you're not awake, but it's this definite altered state of consciousness. If you have enough awareness in that, then you can very easily turn that into a lucid dream. It's like a portal. The little death is like a portal into the lucid dream state that I think can be really powerful. But yeah, one of the things I will say about lucid dreaming is there is definitely a sexual energy element to it, because one of the best ways of having lucid dreaming is like really having a massive crush on someone. Because when you see that object of your affection in the dream state, it was one of my main reasons for being into it as a teenager, was like, when you've got a massive crush on someone, you can meet them in the dream, and part of that will be like what makes you become lucid, because you're so incredibly charged up and excited, and there's so much sexual energy there. So I think that there's a definite relationship with sexual energy and lucid dreaming, and that ecstatic bliss state is a sexual energy manifestation, I think, as well.
Yeah, which you can access from the hypnagogic state. It's like this full body, ecstatic, vibrational state, which I was speaking to Tree about as well, feels like very potential grounds for miracle cures, for this sort of full body cellular vibration. I think it's so interesting. I want to hear all the different anecdotes.
One thing I do wonder is whether women have special access to this as well. I think there's something about the kind of female makeup physiology and neurology that is more conducive to that ecstasy. Like I was talking to one of the Egyptology lecturers about this idea of women presided over the ecstatic rites in religious ritual and worship. There's this idea where women have this special access. I remember I read this depressing article about how the difference between orgasms in men and women, and how women's orgasms are all different. They're depending upon so many different factors. An orgasm can be extraordinarily powerful, bit of a damp squib. There's this huge palette of orgasmic experience for women. And for men, an orgasm is pretty Lego-like, it's the same most times, which is fascinating to me, because it's so completely, and this idea, when women describe orgasms, it's so different woman to woman and experience to experience.
Do you have a particular dream that has shaped you, or that you've worked with in a healing way that you'd be happy to share?
Well, I do have this recurring dream, which I still have now. And pretty much every morning when I wake up, there'll be some trace of this dream is still there. And I've always had this dream my entire life of drinking the water of life. And one thing that I'm really interested in dreaming is this idea of eating or drinking something that alters consciousness within the dream. So I find that drinks and food can act as these agents for dream transformation, which I find really fascinating. So when I drink this water of life, I have this sort of ecstatic or this visual experience. And I had another dream where I ate part of this brick of psychedelic meat.
Wow.
And that changed my consciousness as well. So I've had it a few times, and it's interesting because it makes me think about this idea of Persephone eating pomegranate seeds in the underworld, and that if you eat any food in the underworld, then you can stay there or it changes you. And also I've had dreams where I don't drink, and I have had dreams where I get really drunk, and that's really weird. I feel like really drunk in the dream. And then this water of life, the experience of drinking that water of life can be completely, different from time to time. But that's like my recurring dream, is drinking this water of life. And I said like a while ago, I had this hilarious experience where I was getting my hair cut in Hastings, and the hairdresser happened to grow up in the exact same area of Croydon that I'm from. And we were comparing notes of our childhood. And one of the things he said to me made me realise where my dream came from. He said, "Oh, did you used to drink that magic spring in Beddington Park?" And I was like, oh my God, that was like a sort of urban legend for kids that I'd forgotten about. And so all my dreams are actually this kind of like exotified version of going to Beddington Park and drinking this spring, which we had created this whole myth around. And it was more than just, I thought it was just my little group of mates, but it must have been like loads of kids in Croydon doing this. So after I had this conversation with the hairdresser, as you often find in dreams, when you find out where something comes from, you stop having the dream. But it was such a pleasurable dream experience for me that I didn't want to lose it. So I went through a few weeks of not having this dream anymore. And then I was like, you know what, I'm just going to decide that I am still going to have this dream, even though I've worked out what it is. So I still have this dream now. But when I started to work with this idea of healing in dreams, I've had like several dreams where I meet gods and they heal me in some way. And my favourite one was a dream I had where I met the Zoroastrian god Ahura Mazda, and I was standing in my childhood home on the landing at the top of the stairs, and he descended from heaven. He was this being of pure light, and he walked into my body, and I could see close up and far away. I mean, the visual abilities in the dream state really fascinate me. This fact that I remember seeing those Pablo Amaringo ayahuasca paintings for the first time and thinking, that's how dreams look. They're like this interwoven tapestry where multiple things are occurring at the same time, and it doesn't take this form of this linear narrative that you kind of write it down as when you wake up. It's actually this kind of always interwoven experience. So in this dream, Ahura Mazda descended from above me, and he was this being of pure light, and he walked into my body. But as he walked into my body, I could see my body as a whole. I was in my body, but I was also out of my body observing it, and then also observing it super close up on a microscopic level, where I could see my DNA spirals untwisting. And then he was walking down my DNA spirals as if they were a ladder. They became a ladder when they untwisted, and every rung of this ladder he stepped on lit up and became healed in my dream. And I woke up and I felt absolutely just ecstatic. I felt so changed by that dream experience, and I've had it a few times. And then I've also had a dream where I was told that I should fast for 3 days by this doctor who looked like the man from Del Monte. But yeah, I think like incubating dreams for particular purposes or to meet particular people are really important. But my thing with lucid dreaming, and I think it's something that gets not spoken about so much in terms of what lucid dreaming is that feeling, that bodily sensation, that spiritual sensation of bliss and ecstasy. Like you say, and Tree was saying, that I think that is the healing state, that if you can access that state frequently, then it has the potential to be healing. Because everyone knows when they wake up from a bad dream, they feel horrible. And when you wake up from an amazing, beautiful, awe-inspiring dream, you feel good. And that feeling lasts for ages. So I think the more you can encourage positive, good dreams, the better you will feel. And, I think there's a limit to it, because I think if something's progressed and it's deeply ingrained in the material of your body, it's going to be harder to shift. But one other thing with dreaming is that it can alert you to the early signs of things as well, or an early sense of some sort of imbalance that you can perhaps address there.
Yeah, I'll just quickly share that, I have this autoimmune condition, and it's based around the thyroid, and my body, sending antibodies, attacking the thyroid tissue. And when my symptoms are getting worse, I don't know what comes first, whether it's what's in the body or whether it's the sort of psyche experience, but I have dreams about being attacked and needing to defend myself. And the synchronicity between the physical manifestation of this and my dream world is insane. So I totally believe it. I think it's so interesting. Yeah, thank you Thank you so much for all that you're sharing and doing. And I'm wondering, do you work with people? Could you help me craft a way to really try and create as much healing potential in my dreams as possible? Is that something you do with people?
It's something that I'm really interested in, and it's something that I'm hoping is going to be a development of this work with Rupert, actually, is using, and because we've got Pascal doing the sort of scientific study of this, that perhaps this could be something we roll out to be, I don't really want to do sleep lab research, because I don't think the sleep lab environment is very conducive to the kind of healing dreams. It's a bit like psychedelics being administered in imperial labs and being scanned with scanners. I would like to create a more of a sort of holistic, classical sleep sanctuary type of environment. So this is something I'm working on, putting together a dream festival in Athens next year. So part of that is going to be, we're working on getting access to the southern slope of the Acropolis, where there is the ruins of an Asclepion there, and there is a sacred spring. So if we can get access to that, even spending any time there would be magical. But yeah, I'm working with trying to have, because it's hard, it takes a long time for these healing things to occur. And I think this is the issue, is the NHS doesn't have the provisions to provide a month of detoxification and harmonious surroundings. There's no understanding within the NHS at all of even the sort of food that they're serving being not remotely related to healing or holistic health approaches. You know, if I was in hospital and I had to eat hospital food, I would just feel horrific. And you know, things down to the lighting that they have, the paint colors that they use, the architecture of the buildings of hospitals are just scary. You know, I think that sleep sanctuaries and spa retreats, we're going to have to take a lot more responsibility for our own health in the future, you know, because the NHS is sort of woefully underfunded, and the best route we can have is prevention and looking after ourselves and carving out time to relax and heal and allow the body's own self-healing mechanisms to kick in. I mean, this is the thing with the sleep sanctuaries, that most health issues, if they're not too severe, will resolve themselves over time. So given the right conditions, most health issues do naturally resolve themselves. So it makes sense that these sleep sanctuaries were effective for the majority of people, because if the situation wasn't too severe or the conditions weren't too acute, given the right environments, given lots of sleep, rest, purification, healthy food, healthy air and water, you're going to resolve your issues. So I think we need to find a way of like reinventing those places, because I think they're absolutely like what we need 100% is beauty and harmony and healthful spaces.
Yes. And sleeping close to the earth without all the technological interferences, returning to our circadian rhythms. I really believe in the power of rest and creating space for slowing down, slow healing. I can also really picture a sacred sleep eco centre forming. And you've got your book coming out in the US very soon, in the UK in February, I believe. Initiation into Dream Mysteries, Drinking from the Pool of Mnemosyne. Keep carving imagination and ancient history into our scope, and thank you so much for this time, Sarah.
My pleasure.
You can visit themysteries.org to find the array of offerings Sarah is bringing to the world. You can also explore Sarah's YouTube channel and her various pools of content, all of which are linked in the show notes. And I'll be sharing her research papers with our patrons. We're running a new giveaway, by the way, for podcast patrons. Chris Park's gorgeous book on the River Wye, which he spoke about in the episode Druidry with Wisdom Keeper Chris Park. To enter, you can become a podcast patron from £1 a month, where you also immediately access a rich archive of gifts and resources to expand the topics in this show. Head to patreon.com/rootedhealing, or you can follow the links in the show notes. Visit rootedhealing.org to learn more about our work and sign up to our newsletter. This is important because that's the first place you'll hear about our upcoming gatherings and the juiciest discounts. In February, we are beginning our online voyage, Deepen Your Roots, to cultivate profound belonging, and I am so excited for this year-long slow study to unfold with such incredible guest speakers lining up. And you can also join us in London on January the 22nd next year for a psychedelic, somatic and sound workshop called Qualia, which is inspired by my research into consciousness and transpersonal psychology. And it's a beautiful journey of interconnectivity and an exploration of your own subjective conscious experience through animistic, somatics, sound medicine, inquiry prompts, and integration. Head to rooted.healing.org/Qualia, Qualia, to learn more. We are also arranging a spring equinox dream incubation gathering called Between Dreams, which will provide a deeply nourishing, restful space for practices to open those liminal explorative states. And we are holding deeply healing and transformational medicine retreats in the Netherlands in 2023. So there's lots to explore. Head to rootedhealing.org/gather. I'm your host, Veronica Stanwell. Thanks for listening.